Hello makers, Ruth here. In this video, we're going to talk about screen printing. We're going to be making our own screen print. And so I just want to show before we get started some examples or an example of how our screen print might turn out. This one, we're using our embroidery hoop and netting to create an image that we can transfer to our zipper tote. And so this one, I have a little doggy head that I use. The great thing about screen printing is that once you have your image, you can print over and over and over again. So it's a way to mass produce an image. So I can use this doggy print over and over and over again on not just my zipper pouch here, but on paper and all sorts of wonderful printing surfaces. But I wanted to show an example of our screen print before we talked about supplies. So let me move this out of the way. Now, the first supply I want to kind of talk about is our illustrated instruction. And so this one, just like all our other illustrated instructions, we have our list of supplies at the top that I'm going over right now. And then that process is laid out step by step. This is not absolutely necessary for the video to use in the video, but it is helpful to take notes and reference back to. So it's always good to have on hand. We'll be following along with this today. The next thing I want to talk about are our main supplies. So we're going to be using an embroidery hoop and a nylon netting as our screen, right? So we're just using a small embroidery hoop today, and the nylon netting is about the texture of pantyhose. So we're going to be using this as our screen. And then to create our image, we're going to be using that sheet of transparency. Now, it may be hard to see. It should be towards the bottom of your kit. The good news is we have a large sheet of transparency, so we can make several images that we can change out. And I'll talk more about that as we go through this process. But go ahead and pull out your transparency sheet. The next thing we need is going to be our acrylic paint. We've got 2 rows of some really great colors and then 2 brushes. We have the wide flat brush and the small round brush. We're going to be using that wide flat brush today and our acrylic paint. Know that you can pull in all sorts of acrylic paint. The paint is going to be perfect for the surface we're printing on today. We're going to be printing on that zipper pouch. And we're also going to be printing on paper. If you are wanting to print on like an apron or clothing, a t-shirt, I definitely recommend getting some fabric paint to use instead. But the acrylic paint will work perfectly for what we're doing today. Now, acrylic paint is nice because even if it does get on your hands, it comes off with a little soap and water. So that's the main reason we're using acrylic paint today instead of printing ink. We're going to be printing on that zipper pouch. One of the things I do want to mention is that the zipper pouch is a thin woven material. And so it's always good if you have an extra sheet of like a little aluminum foil or paper, just go ahead and slide that in between the layers of your pouch. And what this does is kind of blocks the paint from going all the way through. So it'll just stay on one side. So if you do have a little extra piece of aluminum foil or a piece of paper, go ahead and slide that in. Now, there are a couple things that we need that are not in the kit. And the first one is going to be a pair of scissors. We're going to be trimming our netting and we're going to be cutting out our image from the transparency. You can use a pair of scissors or you can use an X-Acto knife or craft knife. I'll be using some scissors today. We'll also need a tool to scrape paint. I'm using a watercolor scraps of watercolor paper, but you can use a scrap of cardboard, you can use an old gift card. It doesn't need to be big, just something that's small enough to fit inside our embroidery hoop. We'll also need a marker. We're going to use this to kind of trace our image on the transparency sheet, and so that marker will be helpful. I'm using a Sharpie, but you can use like a washable marker as well. And then the last thing we need is going to be extra paper. We're going to do a tester print on paper before we print our pouch. And so it's good to have some scrap paper. Also, if you have some pretty paper or nicer paper that you want to print on, definitely pull that out and you can use that as well. All right, so our first step, I'm going to pull my illustrated instructions out. That first step is to create our image, and we're going to do that on our transparency sheet. So I'm going to go ahead and pull out a piece of transparency sheet here. Excuse me. Now the image we want to do, because we're doing a transparency sheet, we want to think in simplified silhouettes. We don't want a whole lot of detail. And so on our resource page, we have some images of sample silhouettes that will work for this type of printing process. I'm going to do a heart today. No, you can do your own image, but one of the things to keep in mind is that you want it to be small enough to fit inside your embroidery hoop. And we need a little extra space around the edges. And I'll talk more about why later on. But go ahead and pull out your embroidery hoop. And what I'm going to do is take the inside of my hoop, my inside hoop. Get my hair out of the way. I'm going to take my marker. So I've got my small embroidery hoop, the inside of my embroidery hoop, and I'm putting it on top of my transparency sheet. And I'm just going to take with my marker, just trace around the outside of that hoop. Whoop. So now that I have that circle drawn on, I'm going to take my scissors and just cut out that circle. We want it to be tight against our embroidery hoop, so we want it to be close to the same size. It's okay if it's not exact. That's not important. I'm just going to carefully cut that out. Move these out of the way. And because this is clear and hard to see, I'm just going to take my marker and draw the edges so it's easier to see on camera. Know that you don't have to draw the edges, draw on the edges. I'm just doing it so it's easier to see here. But we have our circle transparency cut out. You can see mine is not exact, and I promise it's okay. It doesn't have to be exact. We just need it to be the size of our embroidery hoop. Okay. So I'm going to take my transparency now that I've cut it out, and I'm going to come over to my image here. I'm going to do the heart today. So I'm going to take my transparency circle and center it over my heart. And then with my marker, just kind of draw that image. So when I lift my transparency sheet up, I've got that heart drawn on there. So now it comes to the cutting out phase. So what we want to do is cut the inside shape out. We don't want to cut through our outside ring. Okay? If we cut through our outside ring, when we add our paint, it will show that ring. And so we want to make sure we're just cutting out the inside. So if you do have an X-Acto knife or a craft knife, it's good to use here. I'm going to be using a pair of scissors. And so the trick I do is folding over my transparency sheet a little bit. I'm not creasing. I'm just folding and cutting. So I have a little pocket there. And I'm just going to kind of go through and cut out my image there. So I'm not cutting all the way through that ring. I'm just cutting the inside shape out. So I've got my heart cut out here. It's one solid ring. And then I'm taking that inside and I'm just going to toss that. We won't need that one for our process today. So now we have our image. Transparency sheet. The next thing to do, if we look at our illustrated instructions, that next step after we create our image is to create our screen. And so the process for that is taking our embroidery hoop and separating it. So we have the inside ring and the outside ring. We're going to take our netting and just lay it on top of that inside ring. And then with that outside ring, we're going to press that on top. This is creating that screen. So we want to make sure that that netting is pulled tightly and that we're twisting that outside ring as securely as we possibly can. So I'm going to twist it a little bit and then just kind of pull that netting through. I want it to be kind of tight here. So I'm just going to kind of pull it and then tighten that screw again and then pull it through. And then tighten it. And we want it, again, we want the screw to be as tight as we can get it. We're going to be using this netting over and over again, and so we want to make sure that it is secure. So after I get it as tight as I can, we have our screen. Now I'm going to go ahead and trim the outside edges, but I just wanted to show if I have my hoop upright and I press my finger through it, it goes through a little bit. It's still pretty tight, but it does have a little give. That's okay. We're not going to be able to make it super tight all the way across, but we want it as tight as we can get it. And then I'm just going to take my scissors and cut some of that excess netting off. It doesn't have to be super close. You can see my cutting is not super smooth, but I have it trimmed, so it's not going to be in my way when I do my printing. So now that we have our screen and we have our image, we're going to combine them. So I'm going to take my screen and put it netting side down so that the netting is flat against the surface. There's no gap. The netting is flat against my surface. I'm going to take my transparency and put it inside my hoop and just kind of push it down so it's flat against the netting. It may take a minute and you may find that you need to trim it a little bit. That's okay. But we want that netting flat against our surface and we want that transparency sheet flat against the netting. So there's no gap anywhere. And now we have our screen that's ready for printing. So if we look at our illustrated instructions, that next step is putting that screen on our printing surface and then pulling or scraping the paint through. Now, when you're doing a full, like a large scale print, you want one smooth motion. But because we're doing a small scale print, there's a little flexibility that we have with that. So before I print on my zipper pouch, I'm going to print on a scrap piece of paper. Now, when it comes to printmaking, that first print is not always the prettiest print, right? But it's a print that gives us information. And so that's why we're wanting to print on paper first before we do our pouch. So I'm going to take my screen and I'm going to put it flat against my paper. Now, there's no gap. That netting, that screen is flat against my surface. There's no gap. It's right up against it. We're going to be using that to print. Now our transparency, if you look at it, our transparency is blocking a lot of the netting. So when we do scrape our paint through, it's only going to go on the part that the transparency is not. Right? So I'm going to do some black paint so it's a little easier to see. And so I'm going to take my acrylic paint, I'm going to take my flat brush, and I'm just going to scoop out a little paint and put it on the transparency. Not put it in the hole, but put it on the transparency. So I'm going to scoop out a little bit of paint here. It's not a whole lot, but I'm just going to set it on the netting there. So that, or on the transparency. And so when I'm ready to scrape it across, I'm going to take one hand and hold my screen still. And then I'm going to use my scraper, which I'm using watercolor paper, but you can use a piece of cardboard or an old gift card, anything that's kind of stiff. We're going to scrape that paper or scrape the paint across. Now, we're not putting a whole lot of pressure on it, but we're wanting to scrape it. You'll find that as you're moving that scraper across, that netting underneath might move a little bit, and that's okay. Just take your time with it. And so I'm going to kind of walk through how to pull a print this way. So I've got one hand that's holding it still. My other hand has my scraper. So I'm just going to grab some of that paint and just kind of pull it across. And you can see I'm pulling it a couple ways. Scraping it across my image. You can see that where the transparency is, it was easy to scrape. Where that netting is, I have solid color pigment. So after I scrape it across, I'm going to very carefully lift my screen up. I'm going to lift it straight up. So we can see our print is revealed. Now, as I said earlier, that first print we pull is not always the prettiest print, but it gives us some information. And so I can look at my image here and see that I need to add a little more pigment or scrape a little extra right on the top because I don't have solid pigment there. Okay? So now I know that when I scrape it across my zipper pouch, I want to make sure I have a little extra pigment in that area so it transfers smoothly. So what I'm going to do is move my test out of the way, pull in my zipper pouch, lay my screen flat against my zipper pouch, and then I'm going to pull out some of my pigment. I'm going to pull some off my scraper here. So I've got some more pigment on my brush. And again, I'm just going to put it at the top on that transparency sheet. With one hand, I'm going to hold my screen still. And with my other hand, I'm going to scrape that paint across. So I'm going to take it and just kind of scrape. And as I said, when we're doing a full-size print, a large scale print, you want to make sure you're doing one smooth motion. But when we're doing this smaller one, we can take our time with it. Again, we don't want to press super hard. Right? We want to be able to scrape that paint across, and we want a little pressure because we want to make sure that we're pushing the paint through the netting. And so just kind of, that's why we want something that's a little stiff, like the watercolor paper or cardboard or gift card, because that can add that little bit of pressure that we need. Once we scrape that paint across, we'll lift our screen straight up. And we have our print transferred. Now, if I pull out my tester print here, you can see I added a little more paint to my top, so I have a more solid color print than my tester print. Now, this print I can print over and over again. Let's say I want to use the same color. I want to use black again, but I want to print on paper. What I can do is, again, lay that screen directly on top of my paper, that screen flat against the surface. And then I'll take my pigment and add the pigment to my screen. Running out of black pigment here. But, add that pigment to my screen here. And then with my scraper, I'm going to scrape it across. So I'm going to take one hand, hold my screen still, and with my other hand, take that scraper and scrape it across the surface. Again, we're not doing a whole lot of pressure, but we want to make sure that we're pushing that paint through. And then once it looks like we've got our paint through, very carefully, we can lift up that screen, lift it straight up, and we have that print transferred on our paper. So I'm going to move these out of the way, and I want to talk just a little bit about troubleshooting. Sometimes you may find that as you're pressing it, pressing that paint through, when you lift it up, you've got some gaps. Let me pull back to my test print here. You may see that there's not a lot of pigment that came through. So what that means, it could be two things. It could be one, we don't have enough paint that we put on our screen, or two, it could mean that we didn't add enough pressure or go over it enough times. And so to troubleshoot that, you can try two things. You can add a little extra paint when you go to scrape it through, or you can just press slightly more firm when you scrape it across. Those are the two ways to kind of troubleshoot gaps in your transfer. You may also notice sometimes that you're getting a little smudging. There's a little bit of paint that comes outside your image. So here, what that could be is that there's too much paint. And so the paint is going underneath your transparency. So the way to troubleshoot that is to use a little less paint. And then scrape it across. It's too much paint. But if you already have that little smudge that's happening, all you can do, like all you need to do really, is clean your screen. And so to do that, we'll take that transparency off. Okay? And so I'm going to use just a wet wipe here, but you can take it to the sink or you can use a wet paper towel. And I'm just going to wipe off my surface here. Because we're using acrylic paint, it comes off pretty easily. Okay? And so I'm just going to kind of clean that surface up. Make it a cleaner wet wipe. So I'm just going to clean my surface up. flip it over, clean both sides. And again, because we're using acrylic paint, it comes off pretty easily. So I'm wiping off that surface. You can do that with soap and water, or a wet paper towel or wet wipe. And then we have that clean transparency. It dries pretty quickly. And then to clean off our screen, you can wash it with soap and water, or do the same thing. You have a wet wipe. I can come over here and just kind of wet that surface. And all that paint is off. You may notice there's like a little tint there. That's okay. The more you use it, the more tinted it's going to be. But you want to make sure that all the holes in your netting are clear, as so you can print more. Okay? And you can see when I cleaned it, all that pigment went to that foil. So now I'm ready to do it again. So I'll take my netting, put it face down so the netting is flat on the surface, and then take my transparency sheet and lay it flat on the netting. And again, it may take a minute to get it all in there. And if you need to trim it a little bit, that's okay. Again, we want it flat. So I've got my netting flat on the surface, and I've got my transparency sheet flat on the netting. So now we're ready to print again. So I'm going to pull my scrap paper out. So you can see that it's cleaned up enough that I can pull the print and use a little less paint so I won't get that little blurred edges, right? It'll be a finer line. Now to clean your screen, you do the same thing. Pull that transparency sheet out. You can clean it, soap and water or the wet wipe. And with the netting, clean it with soap and water or wet wipe. If you want to do a different color, let's say I want to do a different color now. What we'll do is, again, just clean it, put that transparency sheet back in, and then I can use a different color to scrape across. The nice thing about doing the transparency sheet is that you can have so many different images. You don't have to have a whole bunch of screens. You can just change out those transparency sheets and have different images to print. And this will last a while. All right, everyone. Happy printing, happy screen printing. I'm excited to see the results, and we'll see you soon, everyone.